So, what can be said about Staff Cross Country 2013? This. On the 21st of March 2013, we saw this. This. And this. But first, this. Mr. Asadian warming up. This could be described as rather amusing. Mr. Gunning seen in the background, with Mr. Pletz, and now Mr. Gunner.
Well, sort of. I'm warming up my own special way, Freddie.
What, by actually warming up?
I will warm up. Look, we're going to run around this thing twice. Now, that's, let's face it, going to warm me up quite a lot. So when I'm...
No, your muscles.
What? Your muscles. Well, okay, look, I'll warm up. Right, look, I'm moving, I'm bouncing up and down. That is a warm-up.
Something tells me you're going to come first.
I may not... Mr. Pletz off this year, I may not compete as strongly as possible. I'm warming up. Look, there we go. I've bounced up and down. What do you mean?
And now, just before the start, a classic shot always done by Mr. Bangs every year. Now the start, and Gunning's absolutely soaring off. Oh dear, Mr. Shergold, by the looks of things, right at the back. He's going to have to do something a bit better than that if he has a chance in winning. This is now at the bottom of the gravel hill, and Mr. Griffith's going well. Mr. Gunning run out of energy. Miss Winter, Year 7, Mr. Asadian. Mr. Wallace slogging along.
No, there's more around the corner. Come on, sir.
And Mr. Shergold bringing up the rear. Now at the top of the gravel hill we see the rear people coming up. Mr. Shergold once again. And Miss Lassen just spotted she's on camera. Oh, and now we're at the fallen tree in the woods. Year 11 running in the place of Mr. Carlson. Mr. Pletz. And who's this now? This is Mr. Nelson. And about a minute later, Mr. Blunt and Crenell. Not entirely certain what that was. Mr. James coming up now. Sounding a little out of breath. Miss Windsor. And what's this now? This is sort of near the end. Mr. Waller, Mr. Asadian going well. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Ironside. And Mr. Gunnett.
That's enough of that.
Not yet, you've still got another lap and a half to go. Oh, Mr. Shergold looked like he's overtaken someone. Year 7 to be precise. Miss Thompson, not worried about being on camera. And finally, bringing up the rear now, Miss Richards and Miss Lassen, absolutely slogging away at the uphill section in the woods. This is now in the woods. We catch the leaders once again. Round where by the horses are. By where the horses are. Mr. Nelson. And later Mr. Blunt and Dan Crenell. An empty section of path, followed by Mr. James and Miss Winter. Mr. James still sounding rather tired. A bit further down now, we have Mr. Waller, Mr. Griffith, and Headmaster, Mr. Ironside, closely being followed by Mr. Assadian and Mr. Gunning. Still wearing his tie, of course. And Mr. Shergold. And a Year 7. A bit further into the woods now, we see Miss Thompson. Another Year 7. And finally, those who are lost, Miss Richards and Miss Lassen, still slogging away. We're now at the end of the woods, near the water jump. The Year 11 working in the place of Mr. Carlson.
Now's my chance to get them back.
Yeah? What's that for a day?
Until some annoying ones come past.
Yet another Year 7. Mr. Platts. Mr. Nelson.
I move out the way so this is for Crystal Palace.
Yeah, Mr. Blunt and Crenell.
Because the water jumps out of action, we're going to have to get you wet another way. So
You dare.
I've done it to loads of the other teachers.
Oh, you haven't.
Yes, I have. Oh, John.
Miss Thompson being chased by
Go on,
me.
keep going.
Finally, Miss Richards and Miss
Get you
Lassen.
wet.
In case you hadn't guessed, he was throwing water over everyone. Now, where's this? This is Miss Lassen and Miss Richards cheating, by the looks of things, cutting across the field rather than going round back in the woods. Now we're somewhere back in the woods for the second lap. Mr. Platts. Mr. Nelson. Crenell. Mr. Blunt, having clearly been overtaken by Dan Crenell. This was Miss Winter now. Mr. Shergold, having clearly pulled out something special to make up all that ground that he lost at the beginning. Mr. Griffith following. Mr. James. Mr. Waller. Mr. Gunning. Mr. Ironside, having clearly been overtaken by Mr. Gunning. Now we're at the exit to the woods, the year 11 having run in the place of Mr. Carlton, who clearly didn't feel like doing it. Mr. Nelson and my cameraman having just had something lobbed at him. Mr. Platts, yes, he is in the lead.
Teachers, anyone?
Granell.
Go away! Crystal Palace suck. As do you.
Interesting comment. Mr.
keep
Blunt now.
Nearly there. Go on, nearly finished. Do you know where Gunning is?
No, I don't.
Go on, sir.
Mr. Griffith, I really should have told my cameraman to keep the camera still. Not wobble it about as much. Is this Mr.
Go on,
Waller?
nearly there. There's Gunning.
Mr. James, Mr. Gunning. This should be quite close at the finish.
Go on, Gunning, overtake.
Oh no, Mr. James is taking him. We did actually hear later that Mr. James only did that to annoy my cameraman, Freddie, because he was cheering for Gunning. Now Mr. Asadian and Mr. Ironside, this should also be quite close. This is interesting because they are neck and neck into the final straight. It looks like Mr. Ironside has taken him though. We're now at the finish line for the final set of shots.
Yeah, go on, Ben. You alright? Great effort, Ben. Well done. Awesome. 14:58. Well done, Mr. Humphries. 15:04. Well done, Noah. Excellent. Well done. 15:80.
Mr. Nelson.
15:24.
Note how all of the upper school and sixth formers that took part beat the teachers. Interesting point.
Yeah, well done, Splits.
Mr. Pletz.
Good win.
And now from a different angle we see Dan Crenell finishing.
What's the time? 17:06. That's not bad.
Now from yet another angle is this Mr. Blunt finishing in a respectable time. Waving to the crowd as he does so. Miss Winter and Mr. Shergold's really done something good since the start to have finished there. Mr. Griffith, by the looks of things, beating a year 7, who's only run from the other end of the field. Mr. Waller by the sounds of things. Yep, it is. Mr. James having beaten Mr. Gunning and nearly beaten Mr. Waller. That was a close finish. And Mr. Gunning slogging along, straightening his tie for his finish. Oh, Mr. Ironside now. And Mr. Asalian. Miss Thompson, Miss Richards and Miss Lassen all gave up after one lap, so we won't see them finish, I'm afraid.
The answer was Australian, and why did I win? Well, I could have won, obviously, but I decided to let my
The post-race interviews.
colleagues win because I'm just such a sport. So I pretended to be a slow class. No, I had great hopes. I mean, I had a good flying start, and I did have hopes this could be maintained over about 2 miles. But unfortunately, I was
Mr. Gunning waffling on.
150 metres, and it was difficult to maintain us after that.
Mr. James, you just didn't start fast and didn't finish fast and didn't go fast in the middle.
I'm on slipstreaming Mr. Griffiths, who then decided to stop. Losing the slipstream meant that I couldn't continue.
Oh, is that your excuse as well?
My excuse is that Mr. Griffith being rather taller, considerably fitter. Mind you, I had hopes of slipstreaming him, but you see, then, of course, Mr. James got in the way, so it was at that point very difficult to do the slipstream because I was sort of being blocked, and my fabulous fast progress was, alas, arrested.
So you decided to walk?
So I decided to walk, yes, and to thus gain a bit of strength. Oh, I think, well, I was going to let you off, but somebody called Badham decided to nuke me with a large bottle of water halfway round, thus guaranteeing the entire class has their homework tripled. But it's nothing personal, Freddie.
Interesting facial expressions from Mr. Gunning.
How do you think it went?
Not well, John, not well.
No, I've noticed.
I've realised that I'm not a very fit citizen.
Well, there's always next year.
I presumed youth and exuberance counted for more. Apparently they don't.
This is now where Mr. Dell turned up his music too loud.
Because I sprinted off as fast as I could,
I saw that.
and my legs gave out after 400 metres, and I still had to do another 3.5k.
Well, the problem is that's why you don't sprint off at the start.
But it was the only way I could be in the lead for any part of the race.
That's exactly what Gunning said.
Freddie, what
That's
was
exactly,
that?
Yeah, that's exactly what...
I didn't want to monopolise the track. Oh, for one lap, you know. I didn't want to show anyone. Oh, you had sympathy for the track. Yes, that's what
And finally, them all posing at the finish. The end.